The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There's a new report which points out that in May, the proportion of American workers who quit their jobs reached the highest level in 17 years. And there's a couple of different things that we can read into this. One sort of obvious analysis is if you are willing to quit your job, as evidenced by actually quitting it, that's an indication that you have some level of confidence that you can find a new job with equal or higher pay. That's not always the way it works in what are called full employment economies. And there's sort of a debate in the United States as to what full employment is. But an unemployment rate of between 4 and 4.5% is generally speaking considered full employment. When you have full employment, you could say, well, the economy is really good, so I'm sure I can find a new job. But there's another way to interpret it, which is most people are working, meaning there aren't necessarily that many jobs available. And it really comes down to how quickly is the economy growing, where new positions are actually being created. There's another analysis to be made, though. And for this, it's similar to when you hear about the labor participation force, and you hear about 90 million not working, 95 million not working, 85 million, whatever the number is. Some people stop working because they're retiring, and being able to afford retirement is an indicator that is a positive indicator for the economy, but it reduces the number of people that are working. So we do have an aging baby boomer population, and you want to really account for all of these considerations. But there is no question whatsoever that I have no interest in pretending like as soon as Trump became president, the Obama economy imploded. There are some concerning indicators, but by and large, we're seeing a continuation of Obama-era job creation. It's a pretty good economy when it comes to the number of jobs and the unemployment rate, and it continues to be not so great an economy when it comes to wages.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about how this affects employers, right? Because if there are, I guess more people willing to leave their old jobs, does that mean that they can be a little bit less stringent on their demands or qualifications that they're seeking for the new position that they're looking to fulfill?
No, I think it's the opposite.
You think it's the opposite?
Yes.
Because I would think that, as long as someone meets like the company work culture and demonstrates like a basic understanding of a lot of different skills, that they'd be more willing to train them. You know what I mean? Or do you think it's backwards in some sense?
I think it's backwards. Generally speaking, when the unemployment rate is really low, it's considered that there's a smaller pool of unemployed people from which you would be able to hire, right? So that would do what you're saying, which is make employers maybe more willing to accept inferior candidates. But if people are more willing than ever to leave their current jobs, that actually is an expansion of the potential labor pool. So, there's so many factors that account for what an employer is willing to accept in terms of how closely someone matches the requirements. But you've got forces pulling in opposite directions all the time. Yeah,
got to wonder if this strong or relatively strong economy is going to continue for much longer, though. We've seen the economy rise pretty substantially and steadily for the past 8-9 years or so.
Yeah.
And, there are some economic indicators that point to it going to a downturn in some, reasonable amount of time, maybe because of the tariff stuff or a number of other things.
Tom Hartman's been predicting the 2016 recession for a very long time. And of course, we got past 2016. But this is one of those things that, when you're in the world of political footballs all the time, it's very easy to want to interpret everything in terms of partisan politics. When it comes to the economy, number one, no matter who's in office, some downturn is always around the corner. Like historically, there has always been a downturn after every upturn, right?
Yeah.
Unless this is going to be the first time that there's been an upturn with no following downturn, at some point the downturn is coming. Number two, only some of what a president does precipitates that, right? Oftentimes it's regulatory decisions, as we saw with mortgages, and of course we can actually point to the deregulation of the mortgage industry as part of that, which was more heavily a Republican thing. But to some degree, like when Mitt Romney was running against Barack Obama in 2012, there was every indication that 2013 to 2017, right, the time that President Obama's second term occurred during, was going to be a good economic time. Is it possible that if Romney had won, that he would have done something so disastrous that the economy would have been terrible? It's possible, but more than likely 2013 to 2017 were going to be pretty good. And then as we got to the end of that Obama term, there started to be more discussions about an eventual downturn. Some people said it would happen in 2016. It didn't. So I think it's important to remember that when it comes to economic predictions, we're not really that good at it.
Yeah,
we just
really
aren't.
aren't.
That's it.
But I guess there's a case to be made that the Trump administration is doing all the wrong things right now.
Yes, it is.
Like,
Yeah.
we're in a time of prosperity. You probably don't want to be giving people tax cuts. You probably don't want to be deregulating. I don't think the tariffs are good for the economy at large. So while we can't predict 100%, I think you can make a hypothesis.
Yeah, and you can add on top. So you've got like your natural cyclical nature. Natural, I mean, it's all human-made stuff, but you've got your cyclical nature of the economy. And then if you think of policy, policy can either push that up or kind of pull it down. It's very difficult to come up with an individual policy as president that will single-handedly either skyrocket or tank the economy. But you can sort of push it up, down to some degree, accelerate, decelerate that. And Trump is making a lot of really bad decisions. I'm very interested in virtual reality, and I actually recently had the opportunity to try one of the new Oculus devices. It was okay. The resolution is still low enough that it's not a great virtual reality experience. It was like the $200 Oculus thing. But I have been reading quite a bit about the ways in which therapeutically virtual reality can be used. And one of them is this kind of exposure therapy idea, which exists beyond just virtual reality. There's the idea that if you're afraid of snakes, encountering snakes in a controlled environment may help to diminish your fear of snakes, as an example. Virtual reality can be used in this way as an initial exposure therapy, and there is now evidence that at least fear of heights can be sort of tamed without a professional at one side by being exposed to increasingly, I guess we would call them like acute heights situations in virtual reality, and it's not at all surprising to me. I mean, this is what we've suspected for a very long time.
It's pretty straightforward to me, too, because let's say you have a fear of heights. You're going to avoid heights to begin with, right?
Yes.
You're not going to go to the top of a skyscraper. You're not going to go on a roller coaster or walk across a tightrope because you have a fear of heights to begin with, right? But if you're doing so in a controlled setting and you know it's fake, it's virtual reality, you'd be willing to do it. I think most people would be willing to do it because they know in their heads that it's not real.
Yeah.
And that's just one step forward in conquering the fear.
I think there are a lot of people who, if put in a VR situation with this, if they have a fear of heights and something that's like being on the edge of the Grand Canyon or whatever, I think they would have the initial anxiety reaction that the real thing would cause. But then the idea is that because it's virtual, that you can maybe be more willing to stick it out and then allow your anxiety to diminish, and hopefully it would kind of like eventually translate to real world situations. I don't know, but it seems like this for PTSD situations, particularly in members of the military, can be a really, really good thing.
Yeah, I was wondering what other VR scenarios could help us therapeutically, right? Like maybe not just fear of heights, but other irrational fears that people have, like the snake thing that you mentioned. Or,
I think fear of
spiders.
dogs would not be as good for VR because for a lot of people, the fear of dogs is based on like the perceived, and in some cases real, it's an animal after all, unpredictability of the dog's behavior. So for that one, fear of heights is often sort of like an instinctual reaction that even goes beyond the thought that you might fall. It's not even necessarily I might fall and get hurt.
It's unnatural in some sense.
It feels unnatural in some way. Yeah. With dogs, maybe VR could be useful, but for a lot of people, it's just they're afraid the dog will attack, and knowing that it's a VR dog and it's controlled might not actually work to ameliorate the real life fear of dogs. I don't know.
Maybe we're restricted then to just phobias, the irrational fears, because while it's perfectly rational to be afraid of a dog, maybe it's not rational to be afraid of, not a spider, because I guess they could have venom, but
I don't know.
Snakes too.
I think
many of these phobias, I guess, can be kind of rational.
That's the thing. A lot of these phobias, I think, are rational and instinctual to some degree, right?
Yes.
There's probably some evolutionary reason why you would be afraid of a snake, or you would be afraid of, if it's a dog, they came from wolves, and wolves were, they are aggressive animals, although dogs were eventually domesticated by selectively breeding the less aggressive wolves who chose to kind of hang around the campfire when humans discovered fire. I might have made that story up, but I think it's the story of how the wolf was ultimately domesticated. The fear of heights is probably also an instinctual reaction, where very, very early on, if you were roaming the savannas of who knows where, and you come across a cliff, that actually does represent a danger if you fall off of it.
Well, here's a good example. I have a friend who has a phobia towards cotton candy.
Yep.
Absolutely terrified of the thing. Maybe this could help him. I think it's more about the texture of cotton candy, though, which we can't really get from VR, at least not yet.
Not yet, although eventually you probably could.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a very rare thing.
Yeah, it sounds pretty unusual. Alabama's governor has started to cut off a gravy train for the state's sheriffs. The unspent money for prisoners' meals that sheriffs have been allowed to keep for themselves. And this has been very, very fought over, and there's kind of ambiguity in state law. And the argument is that the law allows sheriffs to pocket tax dollars that are unspent for the food for inmates. And to curtail the practice, Governor Kay Ivey has ordered in a memo to the state controller that payments of certain funds related to jail food no longer be made to the sheriffs personally. This is so crazy to me because aside from the fact that the law arguably allowed for it, you don't have to make the payments through the sheriffs personally, right? Like there's other ways to buy the food.
Put it in a public fund.
You do any number of things to prevent that from happening. And this is like a basic thing in companies, which is if it's not absolutely imperative that a particular person handle money, then they don't handle money, right? Unless it's completely necessary. And I guess in some places in Alabama, maybe the case would be made that because it's kind of rural and maybe the jails are small and they're buying food on a day-to-day basis from local places that they figured out we're just going to give the cash to the sheriffs and they're going to pay in cash or something like that. I can imagine reasons why that's something that would be done. But it doesn't really make any sense that it be the policy.
That sounds like the most generous explanation, though. I think it has more to do with corruption. And lo and behold, they would spend very little money on prisoners' food. Like maybe for breakfast, they give them a piece of toast and half of an egg.
It's an
incentive
incentive
and then they pocket the rest of the money.
It's an incentive to figure out how to spend even less money on prisoner food when already prisoner food is not exactly a luxury. And I'm not saying it should be a luxury, but we want to provide some reasonable bottom end standard, lower limit of what the standard will be.
Yeah, and it's amazing what some of these sheriffs did with the money too. Like apparently one of them used it to fund a $700,000 beach house in Alabama. I mean, that's pretty good for him, but not when you're doing it at the expense of the taxpayer and the prisoners.
In total, the understanding is that millions of dollars have been sort of like segregated for this and kept. That story is insane. I don't know on average how much money we're talking for each sheriff here, but we're not talking about insubstantial amounts of money in total.
Yeah, I mean, it would be tough to average it all out because, you know, many of the local sheriffs were not allowed to do this, and I think it just had been done in a few different towns, right? Yeah. But maybe $10,000 a year or something crazy like that, that's insane.
It's absolutely
How do they not know about this?
It's absolutely crazy. And so we rarely get an opportunity to praise Alabama. Hey, they're doing the right thing. They're finally preventing this from happening anymore.
Well, I guess so, but the other way to look at it is that they had been doing this all along.
Of course. And I think in general, any opportunity to be as charitable as possible to Alabama is a good thing to do.
I mean, to their credit, it sounds like they just didn't know it was going on. Like Governor Kay Ivey was like pretty dumbfounded that this was happening.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that it's such a because it's ambiguous exactly whether or not it was legal and why it was legal. I think there were just a lot of people who didn't realize that it was such an urgent thing. But pathetic. And actually, this may be legal in other states as well. There might just not be other states that are aware of it or that are pursuing it in any way.
You should become a sheriff in one of these red states, I guess.
Sounds very lucrative.
My career change.
That is it for today's bonus show. We've got a new show for you tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.